When the Kings need to build a new arena, or when LA wants to build a new stadium, we waive some privileges, we make it fast-tracked. Why can't we do that for all businesses that want to build something, or everybody that wants to invest in California?
CEQA has been around a while, and it's there because Californians actually supported it. But here's the interesting piece of politics and legislative changes. I don't think it's a good idea to do late night, 11th hour changes to CEQA or basically anything, and the legislature has done it. We need to have a real dialogue about CEQA. And what prevents that from happening, there was an attempt a couple years ago with Senator Rubio to start a process, and I was actually very excited about that. There were going to be hearings up and down the state that had started. But what happens is when you have folks who strongly support CEQA and knows how vital it's been to controlling or having community input on development on one side of the spectrum, and you've got folks who think there needs to be some kind of change, both sides get entrenched in politics and really feel like if I give an inch, I'm going to lose a lot. And so I think, and one of the things I'm going to take a look at this year as Speaker is a process to actually start that discussion and actually do what I think the Senate wanted to do several years ago under the leadership of Pro Tem Steinberg and Rubio, which is actually start a real discussion about what we can look at regards to CEQA. Infill housing development. Do you need a full-blown environmental impact report on infill housing when the work has already been done? If you're replacing one-story building with maybe two more, I mean, what do you really need to do to create a full-blown EIR? And that's one example. On the other side, I think Californians do still care about a process in which you do have to look at the environmental impact. And so I think we need to start the discussion, and I'm very serious about doing that this year. But I have to say, polarized positions make people very afraid to have the dialogue.
Well, what about CEQA right now would you be willing to change? Now, again, to provide some background, this is the process that allows people, neighbors, to have influence or input on a project before it goes through. It's also the law that many plaintiffs' attorneys, including here in San Diego, use to stop projects or change things. And it also is often used by other groups, labor and others, to hold back projects that they have different concerns with.
Right.
So what about it would you be willing to change?
Well, I do think the arguments about when a project goes through a community process, they go through the planning committee process, and if it has to go to the planning commission, and then it goes to a city council, and it gets approved, I think there's a problem when a small group of people think that they should be able to then hold up a project that's gone through a real community review. So I think that's problematic. I think there are examples on the other side where a process, seems not to be as inclusive or transparent. And I know that community members can point to examples. I was on the city council for 8 years. I saw both sides of this discussion. So I think that's why we need to have the down and dirty discussion. And I think it's going to take more than one session. And I think the benefit of changing term limits, I'm a 6-year person, I'm out in a couple of years. I think part of the advantage of changing term limits.
You're out in 2016.
Yes.
Yeah.
Couple years. Yeah, give or take a year.
Time means nothing to me.
Well, it does when you're on the short end of and trying to get things done. I think term limits hasn't really helped a dialogue process that may need to take place. Do you start like the old globe?
Yeah, the Point Loma Pause.
Not the old globe, the Starlight. I'm used to this, having represented Balboa Park and Starlight. I think that it's going to require a real dialogue amongst stakeholders and people who are really interested in this. And there are real issues on both sides of this discussion. And we can do sound bites, and sound bites are good for political campaigns. But when you're talking about policy issues in a state the size of California that has managed to protect our coastline and do all sorts of things to make this an incredibly beautiful place to live, I think we need a process where it takes more than a couple of months to actually have this discussion. And I'm committed to doing that, and I'm going to do it as we start the next session.
Right. So the government does hire people, but jobs for the rest of us do come from investment. And I think there is something to the idea of, people who make those investments need to decide and need to feel comfortable that it's the right place, that it's the chance that it's worth making that investment. Neil Kashkari made the case that those people do not feel like it's worth it here to make investments. Are there anything holding back investors, business people, and others from making investments that you'd be willing to change, maybe aside from CEQA?
Well, and if we're talking about business climate, yet again, another discussion that gets reduced to political sound bites. California, still a $2 trillion economy, 8th largest economy in the world, the largest place for investment capital. So something's working, okay? There are businesses that are, you can clap for something working. Something is working. And we've just come out of the greatest depression. Clearly, there's work that needs to be done, but I also want to say that, who is feeling the most of the brunt is actually middle-class Californians. And so while all that looks good up here, and we also see businesses making business decisions, whether to stay or go, whether to expand in California, and you do see businesses making decisions, and every single one of them have said it's about their business model. They want to be clear. Nestle, downsizing, changing the way they do things. Manufacturing has changed in this country. More manufacturing is more high-tech as opposed to what it used to be. So clearly, there are things in the business climate we need to do, and we're doing it. But if you expect us to do it overnight as our economy comes back, that's not going to happen. In terms of the business climate, the governor did create GoBiz, and I want GoBiz to work for people in my community. So he created that as a means to have somewhere for businesses who want to expand to go. And is it working? Yes. We're looking at, as you know, the legislature recently approved tax credits for the possibility of Lockheed Martin could potentially get a Department of Defense contract in the aerospace industry. We're going to be taking up Northrop Grumman when we go back. There's discussions about Tesla. We created California Competes, which is a tax credit to help businesses expand. San Diego County got about $4 million, that $29 million. Next year we'll be doing $150 million. So things are happening. I think some of our focus needs to be on how we support small business, how we make GoBiz and all of that work for small business, because they provide the majority of jobs in this state. So while we want to protect our aerospace industry, historically California, we've been a leader on that. And while we want to look at how to support life sciences, biotech, high tech, because that's a San Diego advantage that we have, we also have to start really looking at how to do the small business support. And so we're tasking GoBiz with ways to do that. So, I know that we can reduce everything we're talking about up here to sound bites, and that may sound good to you. But the discussion about each of these areas and how they intertwine and are interwoven together are really, so it's a broader discussion.
Well, I think part of his point, and I think it's not a bad one, is that if those things work for those companies, tax breaks and other things that incentivize them to grow, why can't we do that across the board? Why do we pick which ones get that?
But we are doing it. We are doing it. I mean, just because we are in a place, California's in a place now where we have turned the corner, it doesn't mean you can do everything overnight. You have to evaluate how you do those tax credits. In addition, the California Competes, we also, as of July 1st, have gotten rid of sales tax on machinery for manufacturing, research and development. I mean, so to say that things are not moving is not correct. If you have ideas, yesterday I met with a group of small business owners in my district, and I said, what do you need? And we talked about workers' comp reform and how the reform in workers' comp was good, but it bubbled out and it's had negative impacts elsewhere. Specifically what? Well, if people are able to self-insure, they remove themselves from the pool, which means small businesses have to pay the cost across the board. So you want to talk specifics, I can talk specifics. But if you want to say we got to do more because we have turned the corner and we've started to do these things, I would say, give me ideas, give me examples. Like the small businesses yesterday came to me about workers' comp. They wanted to talk about minimum wage. They wanted, those are dialogues and discussions we can have about how we shape legislation or policies, or how we shape support for businesses. We can have those discussions, and I think that, I can give you examples, which I just have, of what we have done. And we need to continue to do that. But it takes working together to figure out what is really needed. And I think we're getting that information from small businesses, and in particular, and we need to hear them and try to figure out how to make it more possible for them to expand. Now, when Forbes says San Diego is one of the best places in the country, and we make that top 10 list, that's a good thing.
I think it was cool places.
Cool places.
The coolest place.
Well, there's a business that as well.
Maybe it was just about Voice of San Diego. I don't know. Any other group that would put on a discussion about California Environmental Quality Act in front of the sun and the kids, right? Love it. So
I am trying to figure out. We get the shade, they get the sun.
yeah, it's two Americas, right?
Right.
Let me ask you one thing that he brought up, and I wanted to ask about this too, is this Vergara decision.
Right.
One of the points of the Vergara decision was that it was considered a civil right for a good education, and it was one of the first efforts where education reform was cast as a civil rights case in the courts. And one of the arguments is that not being able to fire teachers who aren't performing, and having other inflexibility in the system had created a situation where kids, especially in poor areas, were being treated or weren't given the opportunity for good education. The state state leaders have been kind of quiet on it. What is your take? Is the legislature going to make any adjustments because of this decision, or in the same parallel path? And do you support appealing that decision? As he said, it hasn't been clear whether that appeal is going to come.
Right. Well, let me just start by saying, of all the things I have been involved in, education is certainly not my strong suit. But it is one of the most important issues that Californians care about. I mean, it's on the short list of things that are most important to us. But understanding some of the complexity of our education system, particularly in a state with 38 million people and with the most diversity in the world, to try to figure out how to provide a fair and equitable education to all students is not simple. And it is certainly why I'm thrilled to have Dr. Weber there with me, someone who spent 40 years in higher education, served on the school board in San Diego, because I really got to tell you, I use folks like her to try to understand these issues. So I want you to know I'm not an expert on education, but from a layperson's standpoint, which I think many of us can be when it comes to education, what I see is this. And by the way, there have been rulings in the past that talk about equitable education throughout California. It was referenced in the Supreme Court case, that upheld the dissolution of redevelopment. It was talking about funding for education and how funding for education is important to the quality of education that every student has a right to. So we have heard these issues before, maybe differently presented in terms of some of the specifics. But here's what I do think. I think that, students deserve the opportunity to learn, and we have to make that possible for every student in this state. When it comes to some of the issues brought up, there were issues of tenure. Whether people know it or not, teachers don't have tenure for life. What they have is a system that in the first 2 years, teachers can be fired without cause. They don't have to be given a reason. The first 2 years they work, they can just be fired with no rationale. After that, there is a process by which you have to go through if you want to remove a teacher. And I think the issue is, how difficult is that process and how long does it take? And so you just saw at least one piece of legislation by Joan Buchanan to streamline that process. That's the discussion we're in, and we don't need a Supreme Court case to tell the legislature that we can make those reforms. We can do that, and that was one piece of legislation that started. Secondarily, in 1983, there was a piece of legislation that went from 3 years. You could a teacher who just started would have 3 years of probation, and if they were fired, they had to be given a reason. And so that went from, in 1983, from having that sort of system to 2 years with no rationale, and after that you have this very long process. So what that tells me as a layperson is that we have a system that hasn't been working and hasn't really pleased anyone. It doesn't please the teachers, who feel like they should be given an opportunity in the first 2 to 3 years, whatever the date you give, to be told how they can do better and perform better and be good teachers. It doesn't make parents happy if, in fact, there is a bad teacher and they can't see action taken quickly. What that means is this system we have has not really pleased anyone nor been working, because there are examples in both sides. If there's a teacher you need to get rid of, there needs to be a clear, understandable, condensed process to do that. If there is a teacher that should be given an opportunity and a couple of parents don't like this teacher because the kid didn't get a good grade, and let me tell you, it does happen. I don't know if there are teachers out there who can tell you they live in fear of trying to do the right thing by holding kids accountable to standards, and then to have parents complain. So yet again, another discussion that is going to take some work. Seniority, the other issue mentioned. So it was these 3 issues in the course of that discussion. There has actually been no agreed upon definition of how you determine the abilities of a teacher. There have been back and forth discussions for decades over how you determine if a teacher is effective. And there have been no agreements. Standardized tests, people have said, well, that doesn't really determine a teacher's ability. The only thing they've come up with is experience, tenure, time, the time you have been a teacher. And I think I can tell you, I'm better today at my job than I was the day I took office. That's experience. So they have translated that into time, which then becomes seniority. Now, the way the state can deal with that is having turned the corner and added $5 billion more this fiscal year than last year to support our schools, means that maybe we can stop dealing with the layoff issue, which is first in, first out, which gets to the seniority issue. But we don't have a good measurement there either. And yet again, Scott's eyes have glazed over because I've taken 10 minutes to explain. But my point there is, and I will get back to your question about should the state appeal, the question I'm getting back to, though, is this has been an ongoing, decades-long discussion, and you can say that it's between labor and the rights of kids, but yet again, you reduce an issue to political sound bites as opposed to what we need to do to support and protect our kids and make sure they get a good education. And so that's our job. That's my job in the legislature. In terms of whether to appeal or not, obviously the California Teachers Association is heavily invested in trying to make sure that their teachers get a good deal in terms of how they're treated. Now, whether Kamala Harris, I know that she's taken time to review the case, and I know that the AG's office, Kamala Harris, and the governor will be talking about that. I'm not an attorney either. I don't know whether we should appeal or not, but I know as a legislator, my job is to try to figure out how we can make better legislation policies that translate into our kids having access to a good quality education. And some of that is about resources and money, and some of that is about systems change, which I'm happy to engage in, and some of that is about making sure that we focus on the reform that needs to be done, and at the same time we try to do it in a reasonable, responsible way and protect teachers who we need to teach our kids and to look out for the rights of kids in our school system.
Do you agree with that judge's conclusion that there was and is a group of teachers, or a very small minority, but extrapolated over 100,000 people, thousands of teachers, that are underperforming and that it is impossible to deal with at all?
Well, I think that there are certainly bad teachers and good teachers. I mean, that's not hard to understand. In any business you run or work, you have good workers and workers who need assistance and help to be better workers, and you have bad teachers. I'm not going to defend bad teachers. I don't think anyone wants to defend bad teachers. But I also think that there's got to be a fair and equitable process where people are evaluated, and it is incumbent upon the system to have a fair and equitable process that balances what we're trying to do in the mission of educating kids. At the same time, I think resources is important, because when you have class size where a teacher is expected to teach 25, 30 kids. Let me tell you, I did teacher for a day in the 2nd grade at Albert Einstein Academy. I want to pay them more. I couldn't do that. So it is a matter of resources. Do I think there are bad teachers in the system? Yes, I do. But if that's some definitive statement that we need to do radical approaches to how to deal with that, I think we need to be thoughtful, responsible, and have process that gets the job done and is fair to people. And clearly, I also think putting more resources back into where we have cut significantly over the last decade. We have seen cuts in education that have resulted in increasing class size, teachers who are buying their own materials to teach the kids. I think there's a lot of places you can point to where we need to be working to fix it.
Well, I'm going to point right now to the Rita's Ice San Diego truck back there and the kids that are bouncing in the bounce house. Rita's Ice is sponsoring our Kids Zone today. If you're not familiar with Rita's, go talk to Liam, who's already made his way there, Liam Dillon. It's a big deal in the East Coast, and thank you so much for sponsoring the Kids Zone.
Did you set him up to do that?
No, I didn't. He's a big fan. He was all giggly when they oh God, Rita's gonna come. Let me ask you about another issue that the state's dealing with. It's called community choice aggregation.
Right.
This is the idea that a city like San Diego should be able to wrest control of purchasing of power away from the local power company. The power company can still deliver the power, but the residents would get a chance to somehow pick how green their energy would be.
Right.
It's run into some challenges at the state level as San Diego moves faster and faster towards something like this. It's a big project of Council President Todd Gloria. What is your particular take on community choice aggregation? Is that something you would support San Diego switching to? Mm-hmm. And let's just start there. What's your take?
Yeah, I absolutely do support it. I think it's an option that we need to have, and it's something that the city of San Diego has put into their framework for how to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, have all of those issues that we care about as Southern Californians, as Californians. So this is Assembly Bill 2145, sponsored by Assemblymember Bradford, and it came out of the Assembly, headed to the Senate, on its way to being passed. And the big discussion about this particular piece of legislation was something called an opt-in, opt-out provision. And clearly, it's more possible for us to have those choice aggregate in place if you have to choose to opt out versus opt in, if that makes sense, if you're following me. If you're going to move in that direction and you want that option, the broadest group of people participating is good. So the bill originally said you have to opt in as opposed to opt out, which makes it harder to do these things. It makes it harder to put these in place, which is a good thing to have in place. So the legislation left the Assembly and headed over to the Senate with that in it, and people were very upset. They don't like that at all. And I supported sending it over because it's a process. Bills get worked on in both the Assembly and the Senate. And the piece of the bill that I liked had a lot to do with transparency, about you need to tell people, you need to tell consumers where the energy is coming from that you're a part of. Is it green energy, or is this aggregate actually picking energy from sources that isn't clean energy and from out of state? We've also supported in-state jobs as we look at alternate energy production. We've supported clean energy. And, I think transparency is as important a part of that process as making sure that there is a system to allow it. So I do support.
Just to be clear, you support the opt-in or opt-out?
I support the legislation as it has moved into the Senate, which is the opt-out, which makes it easier for us to have it in place.
But you want more transparency
But I
and
want
disclosure.
more transparency so that people who care about these issues, who say they're part of it because they care about clean energy, they're able to tell where this energy comes from. So I think both pieces are important.
Let me
One
ask,
piece was there, the other piece was not. As it moved to the Senate, it began to change.
so SDG&E says it's on track for the state's goal of 33%
Right.
renewable energy.
Right.
Is that good enough?
Well, it's a goal, and we're going to reach it. And right now, there's discussions about changing our goals based on our success. And so you're going to see probably legislation in the coming years that talk about raising that goal to push us even further to actually make use of alternate energy. And so I think a lot of people took me to task for letting that bill, well, not that I let it out, but I supported that bill as it came out of the Assembly. And I think that's because there is a process in the legislature where you have two houses. And that bill was due to come back. It has to come back to the Assembly for concurrence. So I have a second chance to not support a bill if I don't think it's moving in the right direction. Every member does. Every member has a vote. And so I wanted to see that bill progress and see that some of the changes could happen, and the Senate did before it came back to us. So yes, I support the concept, and we should be able to have that for San Diego, like Marin and a couple of other places have. And at the same time, I want to make sure the transparency is there so we can gauge whether we have those systems in place because we support alternate energy. Are we getting the energy from clean resources and clean sources? That hasn't been the case because this is a relatively new concept, except for a few counties in California.
So will you let it get to the governor without that opt-in or opt-out that you prefer?
Well, as I believe I understand it and am correct, the opt-out is the preferred method of people who support this,
Right.
support the choice aggregate option. So it's changed. It's changed. That's already been the good piece that changed that people were opposed to. And so let it get to the governor's desk. You presume I have a lot more power than I do as speaker.
You have all the power, right?
Yeah. On the day I was governor and speaker, I had more power.
Right.
But I would assume that bill is moving in the right direction now in a way that people are going to be happier about because it does allow for the option, which San Diego will be happy about, but it also has the transparency and the opt-out provision, which means you'll have more people participating in the program if they approve the program.
All right. Well, if there's folks in the Stone and Crux Partners Beer Garden who take, woo! Now, some of them might want to take Uber home or Lyft home. Now, there's some concern that there's some efforts underway at the state level to restrain ride-sharing, as it's called. Do you support ride-sharing? Are you going to try to rein it in?
Well, I would say if I don't support Uber or Lyft, I'm going to hear about it from my spouse when I get home because she uses Uber all the time. I would say, of course, I support these options. The interesting thing is this is a piece of legislation by a member of the Assembly who has the right, as an elected official, to put forward legislation to figure out whether there's adequate insurance coverage, what happens if there's an accident. When you get a new idea, a new technology, an innovative change, then comes all of the rules around it that others have had to live by, like the taxi cab industry. And do I think we have to figure this out? Absolutely. It's an innovative, new way of looking at the world in terms of sharing. And so I think we have to figure it out. And I think it's an option that very creative. Gosh, I wish I had thought of it. Then I wouldn't be a struggling legislator. Yeah. Right, I've already voted on it once. It's already moved out of the Assembly. But let me just explain a little more about politics. Everybody seems to think as the speaker that I can kill bills or make bills pass, despite the fact that there's another 119 other legislators in the Assembly and Senate. So if a bill passes, they're like, why didn't you stop that? If a bill doesn't pass, why didn't you do that? I'm a speaker. I have a House of 79 other people, Republicans and Democrats. Now, if I want to stay speaker, I better make sure 28 of those people in my caucus will continue to support me tomorrow. If I don't let the process work with members of my caucus, if I'm the one that gets to make all the decisions, then number one, you don't need them, and number two, do we really have a democratic process? So when you see my role as speaker, it's a little bit different than my role as an assembly member. I long for the days of the luxury of being able to say I support a bill, I don't support a bill. Now it's a little more complicated. I have to give the process the ability to work and have legislation, whether it's in the Assembly or the Senate, go through committee processes and go through those tough questions. And if I allow a bill to live another day because I don't get directly involved to either make it pass or kill it, and I might not be successful, let me be clear. I can try to kill a bill, I can try to pass a bill, but only if I'm allowed to do that by my membership. And if I do it too many times, how long do you think I'm going to be speaker when I shut down other people's legislation? So, you want to learn politics? That's a lesson in politics in terms of being a speaker versus being a member of the Assembly. I have to be thoughtful about everything in every direction. Yeah. And do I support these innovative ideas? Yes, I do. Am I going to let the process work and see where we get to at the end of the day? I get a second bite at that apple, too.
Let me ask you about a big thing in the news in San Diego. And you were very proud and supportive of the convention center expansion. Yeah. Now that has been derailed in some ways. It's unclear whether the tax that was passed on hotel rooms is legal without a vote of the people. Let's say, well, you got a role to play, an influential role, but if you were in charge of the city, what would you do right now?
Well, I think, I supported, by the way, when I was on the city council, this method of allowing hotels to tax themselves. We were in a very difficult financial situation. The convention center really is an economic engine for San Diego. And I support the expansion of the convention center. I want to work with the stakeholders to figure out how we can make that happen. Courts rule, and we have to abide by court rulings, and we have to figure out another way through. As I understand it, if there is an appeal or we go that route, it's going to affect our timeline in terms of what, and I'm looking at the head of the port because he was on the convention center, and it's going to be a timeline that forces us into a problem in terms of expansion. But let me be clear, I support the expansion of the convention center. I did support the manner in which collecting the fees that the hotels did when I was on the council. I still think it was a responsible thing to do at the time, given our financial circumstances and the fact that we wanted the TOT that was in the system to be able to fund services at the city of San Diego. So allowing them to collect the tax themselves so that they could put heads in beds and generate more TOT was an option at the time that seemed viable given our economic situation in San Diego. Now, courts have ruled. We got to figure out another way.
Assembly Speaker, are you going to run for mayor?
He said that was a fun question. Right now, what I'm going to do is focus on trying to be a really good speaker.
No.
That's my answer.
Are you going to run for mayor?
I actually have not thought about running for mayor in 2016 because right now I'm trying to get a water deal done.
Yeah. What's the, are we going to get a water deal?
Yes, we are.
When?
Well, it's going to happen Monday.
Monday.
It's got to happen Monday.
All right, you heard it here first.
Well, look, if I were the governor, maybe if he'd go to China and we worked our way down, we could solve this problem. You know, he really thinks it should be a $6 billion bond, and I'm spending all my time trying to say we need a bond that is going to fix problems, and I think $6 billion is a bit too shy. I think $11 billion is too much, $6 billion is too small. But I'm going to stay focused on my job at hand, because if anyone ever wants to support me for mayor, I better do a darn good job as speaker, right?
We are going to have a roundtable up here in a little bit about the future of jobs, education, and housing in San Diego. They're all related. Toni Atkins, everyone.
Thank you, Scott. Does that mean we're done?
Yeah.
Oh.
Are you going to stay for a minute so they can bug it?